and welcome to this edition of World at War. I'm your host, Mohammed Saleh. You can change your friends but not your neighbors. The former Indian Prime Minister Atal Bihari Vajpayee said this in the context of Pakistan. But the same holds true in the context of China as well. On the 9th of December, an estimated 400 soldiers of the People's Liberation Army tried to intrude across the line of actual control in the Yangtze area of the Tawang sector. The intention was to unilaterally change the status quo. But the Chinese soldiers were halted in their tracks and they were repulsed by a strong Indian response. And since then, there is a video of a border clash between the Indian and the Chinese soldiers fighting with bare fists, sticks and stones and barbed wire that has gone viral. This video will give you an idea of the kind of treatment that is being meted out to the Chinese soldiers every time they try and intrude into Indian territory. But it is important to point out here that this video was filmed on the 28th of September in 2021 and the incident is from the border at Arunachal Pradesh. Now, coming back to the 9th of December, China's belligerence did not end with a ground skirmish. There were reports of increased air activity by the Chinese fighter jets on their side of the India-China border. India responded by pressing its air combat patrols to check the Chinese air incursions over the Tawang sector. Incidentally, there was also a mega air drill involving all frontline fighter jets, including the recently inducted Rafale fighters of the 101 Squadron of the Eastern Air Command. Although the Indian Air Force later clarified that this mega drill that took place on the 8th and the 9th of December was not related to the skirmish in Tawang. Now, India and China share a 3,488-kilometer long border, and this has been a source of on and off tensions between the two Asian giants. On the 15th of June in 2020, the India-China border, which had remained quiet for over 4 decades, erupted in a deadly clash at the Galwan Valley. 20 Indian soldiers were killed. Officially, China claimed that it had lost only 5 soldiers in the Galwan skirmish. But Indian agencies pegged the Chinese losses to be over 40, while American and Russian intelligence sources had estimated that China ended up losing anywhere from 35 to 45 of its soldiers in the Galwan skirmish. In 2017, at the tri-junction between India, China and Bhutan, the Indian and the Chinese forces were locked in another staring down contest over the Doklam Plateau. This video of the Indian and the Chinese soldiers engaging in fisticuffs at the Pangong Tso went viral in June 2017. Now, you may wonder, why do soldiers of two nuclear powers, with two of the biggest standing armies in the world, engage in fist fights and skirmishes with sticks and stones? Now, this is down to an agreement that was signed in 1996 that sought to build confidence between the two nations and also to set down the rules of engagement where both nations agreed not to discharge guns in the event of a clash. Now, despite such agreements in place, in the last 2 years, China has immensely upgraded its major airfields of Hotan, Kashgar, Shigatse and Gargunsa. It has also built extended runways, hardened shelters and fuel storage facilities for additional fighter jets, bombers, reconnaissance aircrafts and unmanned aerial vehicles at positions near the Indian territory. Interestingly, China has also deployed 2 batteries of the S-400 anti-aircraft missile systems. And India has mirrored the Chinese build-up. The Northern Command of the Indian Army, that is in charge of the Ladakh sector, has been provided with adequate manpower and firepower. The Western Air Command of the Indian Air Force, in charge of this region, has been equipped with all assets, including a full squadron of 18 Rafale fighter jets that have been stationed at the Ambala Air Base to take any threat head-on. India has also deployed the S-400 surface-to-air missiles. Now, India inherited the borders that it presently has at the time of independence, and respecting the territorial sovereignty of its neighbors, it has never sought to expand territorially. But the same cannot be said about China. In 1949, just immediately after its formation, the People's Liberation Army moved into East Turkestan and occupied it, incorporating the territory as a part of the Xinjiang province. In October 1951, China annexed Tibet in a series of events which Beijing describes as the peaceful liberation of Tibet. Beijing does not agree to the borders that it has with India because it insists that these borders were dictated to it at a time when it was weak. So far, India and China have had three major military conflicts. The India-China War of 1962 broke out when China unilaterally attacked India after a series of border clashes. The ill-prepared Indian forces suffered some serious reverses in the mountain warfare before China unilaterally announced a ceasefire and pulled its forces back. But just 5 years later, in 1967, in the Nathula and Chola clashes, the Chinese again tried to push their way in an act of unilateral aggression. But this time round, it was India that gained a tactical advantage. The Indian forces blunted the Chinese aggression, destroyed several PLA fortifications at Nathula, and also drove back the attacking Chinese forces. In 1987, in another major standoff at the Samdurong-Chu Valley, the Indian forces yet again blunted a Chinese attempt to gobble up Indian territory. Now, China seems to be caught up in a strange time warp. It still thinks it can resort to salami slicing to acquire territory. The dragon appears not to have learnt an important lesson, that the India of 2022 is not the India of 1962. And sooner rather than later, Beijing, which seems to be itching for a conflict, is likely to get a rude shock at the Himalayan frontier. There will be no ceasefire even during Christmas season in Ukraine. The bruising war that has now dragged on for over 10 months in Ukraine has not cooled down despite the freezing temperatures. The United States is seriously considering to send its top-notch Patriot missiles. But Russia has hit back, stating that these high-tech missile systems, if sent, will be legitimate targets which potentially could result in unpredictable consequences. But a question that very few in the Western media have reported on is why there have been no peace talks, despite it being abundantly clear that the only solution in Ukraine will come out of dialogue. Our next report gets you the details.
The United Nations has put out a dire warning. If the Russian airstrikes continue, as they have over the last 8 weeks, then the situation in Ukraine will deteriorate dramatically. Russia has systematically targeted Ukraine's power infrastructure with a relentless barrage of missiles and drones. And even this week, at a time when the Western military strategists have been mulling over how many more high-tech cruise missiles Russia has still left in its arsenal, Moscow rained down at least 70 more missiles on Ukraine. Ever since the Ukrainian counter-offensive began with attacks on the Saki airbase in August, followed by blasts at the Nord Stream pipelines and the bombing of the Kerch Bridge, Russia has turned this into a war to destroy Ukraine's civil infrastructure.
And missile strikes on civilian infrastructure, including energy facilities and hydroelectric power stations, are exposing millions of civilians, especially persons in situations of vulnerability, to extreme hardship during the winter months. And as you can imagine, it is so much colder in Ukraine than it is in Geneva. Over 10 million consumers are facing cuts in electricity, and millions are cut off from a regular supply of water and heat. Additional strikes could lead to a further serious deterioration in the humanitarian situation and spark more displacement.
A ceasefire has been ruled out during Christmas. While the rest of Europe is in a festive mood, Ukraine is staring at the prospect of the war escalating uncontrollably. The United States is planning on sending Patriot missiles to equip Kiev to guard its skies better. But Russia has hit back, saying any Western weapons transferred to Ukraine will be legitimate targets.
Washington continues to twist the arms of other NATO countries, demanding more substantial input into Ukraine's militarization. On November 30, in Bucharest, at a meeting of foreign ministers, U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken said that NATO's supply of arms to Kyiv regime over 10 months has exceeded $40 billion. This is comparable to the military budget of France for 2022.
From the very onset of this war, Russia has repeatedly stated that if its sovereignty is threatened, it would not shy away from resorting to the nuclear option. But on the 16th of December, the Russian Defense Ministry put out this video. A regiment of the Mobile Yar's strategic missile launchers taking their positions in the Tver region west of Moscow. The RS-24 Yar's missiles, which were first tested in 2007, are capable of carrying nuclear warheads and have a range of 12,000 kilometers. The war in Ukraine is now poised at a delicate moment. The city of Bakhmut, which has witnessed the worst fighting over the last fortnight, has turned into a ghost town. 80,000 people lived here at the beginning of the conflict. Less than 10,000 remain now. In Kharkiv, where the power has been knocked out for several days, people were seen going about their shopping in near darkness. It has been 10 bruising months of war, but both Russia and Ukraine are said to have lost at least about 100,000 soldiers each. And yet there is no talk of peace or negotiations. Neither Russia nor Ukraine, backed by the West, appear willing to soften their stance. So even as the common people suffer across Ukraine, the defining headlines of the war still continue to be about missile strikes and the West pumping in more weapons into the battlefield.
Now, at least 3 assailants were killed in a terror attack in Kabul on the 12th of December. The attack claimed by the Islamic State Khorasan specifically targeted a hotel, which is a frequent haunt of Chinese businessmen. Now, despite China having courted the Taliban since it stormed back to power in August 2021, the question, of course, is why are Chinese interests under attack in Afghanistan? Our next report gets you more.
The Islamic State militants staged a deadly coordinated attack in the heart of Kabul on Monday afternoon. Smoke billowed out of the 10-storied Kabul Longan Hotel in the affluent Sharanau area of Kabul. The Taliban security forces rushed to seal off the neighborhood. The attack left 3 assailants dead and at least 2 hotel guests injured as they tried to escape by jumping out of the hotel window. Witnesses reported multiple blasts and bursts of gunfire.
It was 2:10 p.m. and I was inside my shop when I heard a blast sound. I came out of my shop and heard so much gunfire around. Some attackers entered the building that you see behind me and martyred 2 mujahideen near the entrance of the building. Then, the mujahideen closed all the shops around the blast site.
What is interesting is that just the day before the terror attack, Beijing had asked the Taliban to pay more attention to the security of the Chinese embassy in Kabul. The Taliban, who stormed back to power in August 2021, claimed to have dramatically improved the security situation in the country. But there have been scores of blasts and terror attacks that have specifically targeted foreign nationals and members of the minority Shiite community. 2 Russian embassy staff were killed in a suicide bombing outside the mission in September. On the 2nd of December, Pakistan's embassy in Kabul was attacked by 2 gunmen. Islamabad termed the attack as an assassination attempt on its head of the diplomatic mission, Ubaid-ur-Rahman Nizamani. Both the attacks were claimed by the Islamic State Khorasan province, a key rival of the ruling Taliban. The day after the attack on Kabul Longan Hotel, Beijing issued an advisory asking all its citizens to leave Afghanistan.
In view of the current security situation in Afghanistan, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs once again advised Chinese citizens and institutions in Afghanistan to evacuate from Afghanistan as soon as possible.
Beijing has long feared that Afghanistan could become a launchpad for minority Uyghur separatists, especially in the sensitive border region of Xinjiang. a mutually beneficial relationship has been meticulously crafted, wherein Taliban has promised that it will not provide any kind of support for Uyghur separatism. And in return, China has offered economic support for reconstruction of war-ravaged Afghanistan. Even though Beijing has shied away from recognizing the Taliban government, it is one of a few handful of countries to maintain a full diplomatic presence there. Pakistan, China, Russia, Iran have all been accused of supporting the Taliban at various points over the last 20 years. It's a bitter turf war in Afghanistan, where the ISIS has staged attacks questioning Taliban's ability to govern the country. At a time when the Taliban is at pains to portray Afghanistan as a safe for foreign diplomats and businessmen, these intermittent attacks erode any gains made by the Taliban since it has started to rule in Kabul again.
More than a dozen protesters have died in violent clashes with security forces in Peru. The protesters are demanding for the immediate resignation of the newly elected President Dina Boluarte. Additionally, they're also calling for the immediate freedom for her predecessor Pedro Castillo and also his reinstatement. The escalating demonstrations have expanded to more regions and are showing no signs of abating anytime soon. The government in Peru has declared a state of national emergency to clamp down on the protests. Our next report gets you the details.
Political chaos has resulted in violence on the streets of Peru. 7 people, including 3 in their teens, have now died in escalating protests that have now spread to 13 of the 24 regions of the country. In detention since the 7th of September, Pedro Castillo has been charged with rebellion and conspiracy. This after he dissolved the Congress and vowed to rule by decree.
I don't mind staying here the whole year or even 2 years. What we want is freedom for the president, Pedro Castillo.
Castillo's 17-month rule wasn't a smooth sailing affair, though it did begin in a fairy tale fashion, with Castillo winning a runoff election in June 2021 by just 44,000 votes. Something of a political novice, his reign was marred by 6 investigations against him and his family for alleged corruption, mass protests demanding his removal, and a power struggle with opposition-controlled Congress. A former school teacher and a union leader, Castillo always had a strenuous relationship with Peru's political elite. His strongest support base came from the Andean region, and he was always a political outlier in coastal Lima. Rural unions and organizations representing indigenous people called for an indefinite strike in support of Castillo. Their demands include suspension of Congress, early elections, and a new constitution. Castillo's successor has so far failed to quell the unrest. In an attempt to ease tensions, she has announced preponing of elections by 2 years. This, though, hasn't had the desired effect on protesters. They've continued to block roads in several cities throughout the country with logs, rocks, and burning tires. On Monday, the 12th of December, over 2,000 protesters smashed runway lighting, torched security booths, and forced the closure of the airport in Arequipa. The airport of the second largest city of Peru was only secured after a few hours when police dispersed the protesters with tear gas. The protesters even occupied one of the largest factories in the country, owned by the dairy company Gloria.
Dina Boluarte does not represent us. She's a traitor. She's incompetent. And now she should be in jail because there are already many dead in the country. We will continue until our president is released.
Even Boluarte's home region of Apurímac was not spared and reported casualties. The leftist governments of Mexico, Argentina, Colombia and Bolivia have backed Castillo, insisting that he's a victim of anti-democratic harassment. Castillo's appeal to be released from provisional detention has been rejected by the Supreme Court. Peru is no stranger to political uncertainty and is on to its 6th president in 6 years. The rejection of Castillo's appeal when the Andean nation is facing its worst drought in half a century could further inflame violent protests across Peru.
The Russia-Ukraine war and the India-China skirmish in Tawang dominated the headlines this past week. But away from the spotlight, there are other theatres of conflict that are brewing and that threaten to erupt into bigger conflagrations.
Japanese Prime Minister Fumio Kishida on the 16th of December announced the country's biggest military build-up since World War II, with a $320 billion plan that will buy missiles capable of striking China and ready it for sustained conflict. Japan is worried that Russia, through its invasion of Ukraine, has set a precedent that will encourage China to attack Taiwan, threatening nearby Japanese islands, disrupting supplies of advanced semiconductors, and putting a potential stranglehold on sea lanes that supply Middle Eastern oil. Fumio Kishida, in his analysis, has said that the current capabilities of Japan's self-defense forces were insufficient and that the security environment around the country was becoming severe. Iran has executed 2 protesters publicly for taking part in the unrest that has gripped the country, while another 26-year-old football player, Amir Nasser Azadani, has been handed out the death sentence for protesting against the Iranian government. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights has deemed the situation in Iran to be critical, as the Iranian government has hardened its stance against the protesters. More than 400 people have been killed during these protests so far that broke out after the death of 22-year-old Kurdish woman Mahsa Amini in morality police custody on the 16th of September, after she was arrested for wearing clothes deemed inappropriate. Tehran has blamed foreign enemies and their agents for orchestrating these protests.
Thanks for watching World at War. And if you want to reach out to me with any comments, suggestions or feedback, please feel free to do so on the Twitter handle that you see on your screens. I'm your host Mohammed Saleh, and I'll see you again next week.